Thank you very much. And I hope you can hear me. I have a low speaking voice, and so if you can't, please raise your hand. As a representative of the University of Iowa, I thought I'd talk a bit about several Iowans, one war, and a largely unexamined part of that war, and that relates to the subject of avarice. And by background, I think it's important to present some perspectives that aren't always thought about. One is that war has been a constant in history. But by a quantum measure, World War II was the most monumental war ever engaged in by any country at any time. Its geographic breadth was unprecedented, as was the loss of life, as was its relationship to an unprecedented ideology of hate, which led to gas chambers, mass theft, homes, businesses, pots, pans, clothes, blankets, savings, art, and most ghoulish of all, teeth gold. That is, if you saw the movie The Monuments Men, there was a scene in which soldiers go into a cavernous kind of room where they find some bars of gold, and then there is a barrel of odd-looking gold chips. And that is meant to symbolize that the Nazis actually took bodies and pulled gold from teeth. And if there's a ghoulish incident in world history, there are none that top this particular circumstance. I'm going to begin this discussion with a little bit of a pre-war setting for a number of reasons. One relates to the fact that the United States was, as the rest of the world, in a depression. And it led to a great deal of despair and anguish. And it led to what often happens in difficult times, the growth of extremist groups everywhere in the world. In America, we had a leftist movement. We had a group of people who identified with the Communist Party in an odd kind of way. It was kind of for most, an idealistic kind of socialist concern that capitalism wasn't working. We also had movements to the right, something called the American First movement. The left was heavily influenced by artists. Of the right, some prominent Americans identified with the America First movement. Everyone from Charles Lindbergh, who was in some ways America's first great celebrity, who was very intrigued with what the Nazis were doing in Germany. But it included people like Joseph P. Kennedy, and his son, John F. Kennedy, who was a senior at Harvard, identified with the America First movement. And so we had a right and a left in America. And there was a commonality, if you take the vast American middle, the majority of Americans did not want to get involved in the war, either in the Far East, which the Japanese had initiated as early as the early 30s, or Europe, which the Germans initiated in the latter part of the 30s. This was a country that wanted to be neutral, and the fact of the matter was the Congress of the United States passed neutrality statutes. And so what brought the country together in many ways was Pearl Harbor and the almost immediate aftermath of Germany declaring war on the United States. And so suddenly the left and right and the center all came together in concern about this war. But what I would like to note about Iowans, because I think it's often interesting to say where we were at this time in this moment and what leadership we had. One of the people that I consider to be one of the most overlooked important characters in American public life was a man named Harry Hopkins. Some of you may know that name. Harry was born in Sioux City, a graduate of Grinnell College, went to New York City as a social worker, where he came to know the Roosevelts. In any regard, he became our greatest chief of staff to a president of the United States, although they didn't have the title back then, chief of staff. Harry Hopkins lived for 2.5 years in the White House, largely in the Lincoln bedroom. And he came to be identified with possibly the singular symbolic American social program of the 30s, the WPA, Works Progress Administration, that built lots of public works and buildings. In fact, I had a grandfather on my mother's side who was a citizen of Des Moines, and for $1 a year was the head of the WPA in Iowa. And it was a controversial program, but one that basically the public supported. Then there is a second aspect of international affairs where people really never knew the involvement of Harry Hopkins, but he was the closest confidant to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and also the closest confidant to Eleanor Roosevelt. And those are two very different personalities in very different ways. And FDR sent him to Great Britain in the late 30s to analyze whether Britain had a chance. And Winston Churchill had just been named prime minister and was offended that such a low-ranking American would come over representing the president. But the Brits felt that they had been presented a United States ambassador from 1938 to 40, probably the most crucial years of any American engagement with Great Britain, whose name was Joseph B. Kennedy. And the Brits reviled Kennedy because he, as a pro-Irish person, hated the English, and he was pro-German, which was not exactly the right mix for an American ambassador as war developed when the United States was not part. In any regard, Harry Hopkins did this tour of Great Britain, and in taking this tour, was impressed with Britain, and the Brits were impressed with him. And in his last event, they held a dinner party for him, and he concluded it with quoting Old Testament, and I forget the exact scripture, but the effect was, "Kith and kin stay together." And he, therefore, thenceforth became known as Churchill's man in Washington. He was also the primary architect and advocate of something called Lend-Lease. And the precept of Lend-Lease was, under neutrality statutes, we could not do certain things, but Franklin Delano Roosevelt, pressed by Harry Hopkins, said we have to aid the British, and so we lended them ships, lended them military equipment under a Lend-Lease provision, which was a way to get around law. In other words, it was dubiously legal. Hopkins also took a extraordinary trip around the north of Norway on a military transport plane to Moscow, where he met with Stalin. And he concluded, although when he landed he was almost dead, he had half his stomach had been removed, he had a cancerous stomach, and he had to have blood transfusions before he could meet with anybody. And as he came out, the same event type of thing, you're riding in this military aircraft in the back with its not air-conditioned comfort. It was quite a voyage. In any regard, he argued to the president that we should give aid to the Soviet Union, recognizing that the Soviet Union was going to be a potential rival for us in many different ways. But he recognized that, essentially speaking, the greatest alliance that could possibly develop would be the British-American-Russian alliance, which is arguably the greatest alliance in the history of war. And we gave $20 billion of military equipment. The Russians lost 20 million lives defending their homeland. And it was probably the wisest geostrategic decision in the history of our country. And yet at the same time, we knew that the people we were aiding would become adversaries in potential after the war. And I'm going to get into that a little bit later. But all I'm saying is this was a man who, before the war, could not have exhibited more good judgment at a time that he was standing against the tides of American public opinion and caused FDR to move against the tides of American opinion. The second person I want to mention is a person that everybody in this room knows for a very different set of reasons. And this is a citizen of Mount Pleasant, Iowa, who received his PhD at the University of Iowa, named Jim Van Allen. And everybody knows Jim as the great space pioneer. But in 1939, Jim Van Allen was a recently minted University of Iowa PhD and a Carnegie Institution Fellow in Washington, D.C. And he began work with a group called Section T of a group called the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism. And this was a top secret group that was part of and sponsored by the National Defense Research Committee, which had been set up with some public acknowledgement before the war. And this particular department, this particular group was charged with developing, and this is prior to war breaking out, the notion of developing atomic weaponry as a theoretical possibility and upgrading sonar and radar, which had been World War I capacities that needed significant upgrading. His group, called Section T, was part of a group sponsored by the United States Navy. And he in particular was tasked with a particular challenge, and that is all navies had a problem, of which ours, of the three important ones, the German, the Japanese, and the American, was the worst, with long guns on big ships. And basically, statistically, of shells that left these long guns on big ships, fully a third exploded in flight rather than on contact, and if they had contact, didn't explode at all. And so this group was tasked with developing a new fuse, which Jim proceeded to do, and in trying to develop it, the group had rented a failed garage in Chevy Chase, Maryland, and then Jim rented 40 acres of farmland to test approaches. It was like shooting off fireworks. The garage eventually became the Johns Hopkins Plasma Physics Lab. The field that he tested, and it was kind of a one-man artillery range, he would shoot these things off and run and find what had happened to the fuse mechanism. He was told, gosh, there are lots of spies around here, you have to carry a weapon. And he said it's illegal, so they made him deputy sheriff of Montgomery County in Maryland, so he could carry a .45. In any regard, he developed and patented a new fuse mechanism, and then the group proceeded to develop something even more sophisticated, and that was they started to work with radio technology and developed the first smart weapon in the history of war. Now, Jim in his, well, I'll come to this in a second, and what they found was by developing a technology that the long shell challenge was to have shells impact or explode on impact. And all that did was increase the firepower of the United States Navy by 50%. That is, if you go from 67%, 66% effectiveness to 99%, that's a 50% jump. The second endeavor was to develop an approach that you'd have explosions before contact. And this was related particularly to anti-aircraft weaponry. And everyone that's ever watched a World War II movie knows that you see these movies where there's something called ack-ack, pop, 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 as the planes go through. Well, ack-ack means that you miss. But the gunners loved ack-ack because it could kind of show about where their shells were going. In any regard, the new shells increased the capacity of anti-aircraft fire by about 1,000%. However, the Navy gunners and captains of ships didn't want to experiment with this because people like their ack-ack. And so Jim takes off his scientist cap and volunteers to be commissioned in the United States Navy as a lieutenant commander to allow him to commandeer a ship in which he goes into the Pacific and he goes ship by ship by ship to try to convince people to use the new shells. And the Navy, these naval people would say, well, we've got to experiment first. And in experimenting, they found that a large number had begun to fail, and so Jim takes apart some of these shells and finds out that many batteries that had been part of them had come over in overheated ships, and that they failed in their, by the time they landed in the Pacific for use. And so he became an inventor who became a salesman, who became a repairman, who became a supply officer to make sure that, and then he experimented in combat with these shells, that they would be used. And finally, the Navy in the Pacific accepted his reasoning, partly through the experimentation, and at the largest naval engagement in the history of the war, of all war, which is the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese sent their first massive kamikaze attack against the United States Navy. And these planes flew very low, but Jim's shells ended up knocking down virtually all the kamikazes. And so this was considered quite sensational in that particular engagement. But the bigger involvement came in Europe, where the Brits started to use these shells. And in one engagement, when the Germans started to send the V-1 buzz bomb, they knocked down 68 out of 72 buzz bombs that came over London. And so they came to have an effect in naval engagement as well as in Europe. And then, because of fear that the Germans in particular would find out about the technology, they weren't used in land warfare until December 1944, when at the Battle of the Bulge, Eisenhower allowed their experimentation. And what they did in this case with these proximity fuses, they took artillery fire, and instead of having shells land upon impact, they exploded 10 feet above ground. And they were so devastating that General George Patton later observed that what he called the funny fuse had changed all criteria for land warfare, which is a fairly amazing phenomenon. Anyway, I reference this for a couple of points. One, at a celebration of Jim's life at Hampshire Auditorium a decade or so ago, 4 people spoke about it, and the first one was an elderly scientist from Johns Hopkins who said, I'm going to talk about Jim Van Allen serving the United States Navy and then being in the United States Navy in World War II. And the whole audience, no one knew what he was talking about. And then he ended with, now I want to read a citation. And the citation he read, signed by the Secretary of Navy in 1946, began, no individual is more responsible for the success of the United States Navy in World War II than Lieutenant Commander James Van Allen. I personally believe that arguably Van Allen was the most important combatant in the most important war in history. That is a fairly astonishing conception. Now military histories, and it's only began in the last 5 years, to referencing the fourth point I made, suggests that the United States prevailed as readily as it did, although it wasn't that readily, in World War II because of four great mathematical and scientific advances. One is obviously the A-bomb. One was the mathematical techniques of breaking the German code, which was then applied to the Japanese code. One was the upgrading of sonar and radar. And one was the proximity fuse. Now, the reason no one had ever heard about this was that at the end of the World War II, the A-bomb was obvious, radar was pretty clear, but we're in a Cold War, and the proximity fuse is still top secret. And it wasn't until 3 decades or so later that it became a great public, or a militarily public observation. In his CV, Jim had, for the University of Iowa and the public, the notation, World War II, Assistant Gunnery Officer. He was a bit more than that. A second Iowa City University of Iowa graduate I might mention is a man named Max Showers, who was part of the group who deciphered the Japanese code. He later rose to the rank of Admiral, Chief of Staff of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and a top official of the Central Intelligence Agency, and he won Distinguished Service Medals from both the CIA and the Department of the Navy. Now, an aspect of breaking these codes was that not only did we do it, but the other side never knew we did it. In other words, one of the great tactical advantages we had in the Pacific, for example, the Battle of Midway, where 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk, was based virtually exclusively upon the fact that we knew where they were and why they were there. And they didn't know that we knew. In Europe, when you think about the great landing at Omaha Beach, where my father was, if the Germans had knew on a timely basis that the landing was Normandy, there is not an insignificant chance that that engagement could have been repulsed. In fact, the greatest speech never delivered was written by Dwight David Eisenhower, who had written, and we have this record of it, this statement, "I take full responsibility for the failure of the landing." And luckily, it didn't have to be delivered. And one of the reasons that it was successful was we could track where the Germans were and what they knew. And if they had massed at Omaha, we would not have landed at Omaha. And so I raise these things partly because if you think about it, and you think about American education, which is under such attack today, what in heaven's name would we be as a country if we didn't have this great education system and these great capacities of people to come forward in innovative and absolutely brilliant kinds of ways? Now I want to talk about the liberal arts. And the reason I mentioned, and I'll get into this in a bigger way, and I want to come back to the aftermath of this war and some of the dwelling aspects of the war. And let me just begin with the whole notion that the Holocaust has to be considered the greatest sin ever perpetuated by mankind. There are many interesting aspects of this, and I say interesting with care because they're so appalling. But in this setting, lots of things occurred. And one of the great questions was, why were certain things not reviewed to the same degree that they should have been at the end of the war? That is, not only did we have the greatest mass murder in history, we had the greatest mass theft in history. And again, you think about businesses, you think about homes, you think about the ingredients of life, clothing, bedding. What happened to all of this? We know it was taken from people. Who took it? I mean, often it was neighbors. And then you think about what are the implications of that in the after effect. Now, the history in many regards is more controversial than current events. And the oddity, and it was noted, frankly, in that very thoughtful introduction, that I was slightly insulted. Ma'am, you called me a senator. And I'm a creature of the House of Representatives. And the House has many resentments against this upper-level body. But thank you for your thought, but it was misdirected. In any regard, one of the odd powers of chairmen of committees of a legislative body is that it's the authority to establish agendas. And I had read some articles in the mid-90s that were page 15 of yes.
Your microphone is quit functioning, sir.
I'm a little bit hard of hearing.
Is this better? Maybe. I think the mic is turned off. I'm not sure. Does that put it back on? Yes, it does. All right. Now is it better? Okay. In any regard, in the mid-90s, I had read some articles about Switzerland, about some things that people had looked at earlier about Swiss banks and the role of the Central Bank of Switzerland during World War II. And everybody vaguely knows about Swiss banks, that Swiss banks have secrecy laws that other countries like the United States don't have in the same way, although a number of other countries in the world have developed as an incentive to get bank deposits. They were largely generated in the 30s, and they came to hold the assets of many Jews throughout Europe because Jewish populations had been subjected for generations to governmental takings of assets, and also what might be considered quasi-anarchist pogroms. And so funds that would be put in Swiss bank accounts would be secret. Now, ironically, at the war's end, these great secrecy provisions proved to be a ready tool for use of others to abscond with these savings. And for example, the Swiss banks required of family members death certificates. Well, Auschwitz didn't offer them. And the many people, and I'm going to give an anecdote that some of you in this room might be familiar of the type with. 20 years or so, maybe 25 years ago with my parents, I was at a party in Rock Island, Illinois with a family, and the lady of the family, who was my mother's age, mentioned to me that she had that summer had been to Ukraine, and I asked because she knew had studied some Russian affairs at one point in my life, and I asked her why, and she said she wanted to find out about her families, that her family had come from a village in the 20s or so. And I said, well, what did you find out? And she said, all my relatives we knew were dead, but we wondered how and why. And so we took this trip to Kiev and then trains to this village. my sister and I went, she said, and we asked people about what happened, and no one knew. Everyone we asked, no one knew. And we didn't understand it. And as we were leaving and we were carrying our bags to the train station, there was a babushka in a doorway. A babushka means, in this case, a grandmother type that's probably a widow in black garb. And she waved to them, and they came over, and she explained in what language I don't know, but they could understand, that on a given date in, I think it was 1942, the German army was coming, and the village kind of knew it. And when the German captain rolled into the town in a Jeep, the mayor walked out of City Hall with a presentation, and the presentation was a list of all Jewish citizens of the town and their addresses. And the Germans immediately rounded them up, and they put them in the town square with a fence around them, and then proceeded for several days to neighboring village towns and brought people to join them. And then there were signs up that the people in the town could not provide food or water to these people, and then they were marched down a road 3 or 4 miles and in a ditch, and then everyone machine gunned down. And this lady told this story, and you know, it's hard not to have tears well up, and I was just shaken by it, but she had come to grips with it. But what I'm getting at is that we think of the Holocaust as exclusively gas chambers, but probably more people were killed in that kind of fashion. And what a horrendous setting. And so one of the aspects of World War II was its aftermath. And why was there not more done on reparations? And if you're dealing with murder of genocidal dimensions and theft of continental scale, what do you do? And at the time, we did relatively little. At the end of the war, and this is, I've tried to think through the possible reasons, but there was widespread denial, and in some regards, inability to come to grips with the scope of what had occurred in the Holocaust. There were so many dead that there were no witnesses. And then there was an assessment in the capitals of Europe that was a very serious assessment that probably at the end of World War I, reparations demanded were perhaps so stiff of the German people that it had laid a base for Hitler's movement to rise. And so the Allies, victors, were thinking, do you want to repeat that or not? And then there was obvious concern about the Soviet movement into Eastern Europe and potentially Western Europe. And so we wanted to have Germany, at least West Germany, as a bulwark against the Russians. Then as time went on, and particularly by the mid-90s, there was a convergence of 3 historical facts. One was the end of the Cold War. The second was the dissolution of what was called the Warsaw Pact, and that's the Soviet NATO. And the third was the reunification of Germany. And in this spectrum of events, among other things, people, largely European, had scholars had come to get a better grip on statistically what had occurred, and that the historical record started to show that depth of accountability went beyond simply the government of Germany at that time. Now, a lens from abroad might suggest that you take the United States Congress and some of the luster has gone off it. It's gone off it in the American people, it's gone off it in the eyes of the world. But Interestingly, at other periods in history, and the 90s were closer to the other periods than the current history, the United States Congress is a bellwether for other parliaments. And so in starting hearings on this subject, it got virtually no public attention in the United States, but it got massive attention in Europe. And the House Banking Committee hearings precipitated hearings in half a dozen other European countries of a similar dimension. And they and acts of the executive branch, the Clinton administration had a terrific Undersecretary of State, who later became Undersecretary of the Treasury, named Stuart Eizenstat, who led an administration effort in this regard. And in combination with the House Banking Committee hearings, there was a precipitation of three commissions to review the Holocaust asset sets of responsibilities. One it was an all-Swiss circumstance led by a historian named Jean-Francois Brugier. Another was led on a worldwide basis by Paul Volcker, the former Federal Reserve Chairman. A third was led by a former Secretary of State named Larry Eagleburger to examine aspects of the insurance industry. And in the insurance industry, like in banking, many life insurance claims were not met because of the simple fact that death certificates couldn't be found. In addition, what is the circumstance if one's property is ransacked, as occurred in Germany in more than a few instances, the most famous being Kristallnacht? And what are the rights of insurance policies of protection when property is taken? In any regard, because of all of these commissions, hearings, and Eizenstat-led negotiations, a number of very minor but symbolic reparations issues were reconstructed and reviewed, and insurance companies came up with funds, banks came up with funds, governments came up with funds. In fact, I initiated legislation in the Congress related to some modest liabilities of the United States government. When you come to the subject of art, it was the least of all the issues in the sense of affected people. But it was symbolic in incredible ways. One, because some art has come to have certain value, but much more symbolically, art implies culture in a very, very deep way. So what the Monuments Men came to symbolize was how America was going to respect peoples and their cultures. And one of the things, if you saw the movie, that wasn't gone into, they were insubordinate. And what I mean by that is, normally you think if you're a military officer, you come under a chain of command and you don't publicly rebuke your chain of command at the very top. But they wrote what in effect was a one-page manifesto in which they, in beautiful language, described the importance of culture to people, and to steal culture is something that should never, ever be done, and that it represents one of the great crimes against countries and peoples, which they publicly sent up to the highest chains of command in Washington. And one might say, why would they do something like that? And part of the reason was that museums in America, some of our most prestigious and largest, coveted some of the art. And they had in fact, approached this Pentagon about getting some of the art, and there was an initial okay to the process. And so these captains and lieutenants and sergeants, who later came to be PhDs, some had them then, and prominent in their fields, the most important of which being the University of Iowa graduate George Stout, played by George Clooney, said, we have to show American values. And in my view, George Stout symbolizes the first initiative to win the Cold War. And it started as the war was proceeding. And that is an extraordinary notion that when you think about people and respect for other people, that one would, as a society, say you have to protect certain things. And we proceeded to do that. And why it was so important in the Cold War was that to some degree, our troops were informed of what would be imperfect to bomb. And we laid waste to a lot of in German cities, as well as Japanese. But we made some efforts to avoid certain things. And it's World War II, in an odd sense, symbolizes maybe the only war in history that troops on the ground knew less about how horrible the enemy was than was the case. Normally, in things like war, you think worse of the enemy than might be the case. In World War II, that wasn't the case. The historical record is clear that at the highest levels, that is the president and the highest military command, knew about the camps. And so to this day, there's still a question why more wasn't done to free the camps earlier, or at least bomb railroad lines to them. And there are arguments on the other side. But that question is a very profound and very deep moral question. But the troops in the field did not. The troops were astonished to come upon these camps and what they found. But people in Western Europe, lower than high commands, knew more about it. And so, for example, there was anecdotal evidence that we witnessed about or heard stories of Jewish families in countries like the Netherlands bartering assets, including art, to get excess visas or assigned to lower levels of camps. That is, not all the camps were death camps. Some of the camps were labor camps where a significant percentage of people died, but they were used as labor. And they had Jewish citizens as well as Slavs, as well as gypsies that would be assigned to these camps. The fact that people knew these distinctions, but the troops did not, is a rather extraordinary phenomenon. In any regard, certain compensation occurred in the wake of the hearings in the 90s. The assumption of virtually all the parties was that let's get over this by the turn of the century and so that we can put it behind it. And because the number of people affected were declining dramatically because of mortality. And so certain companies, certain financial institutions, certain governments were willing to do more to simply get this as much behind as possible. In any regard, historical inquiry itself is never capable of unveiling everything, but this is particularly the case in this instance where the crimes were so savage and redress so overdue. But the records will never be completely told, and maybe never even partially told to an adequate level. And it's pretty hard to conceive of justice that could possibly be adequate. I mean, civilization, for instance, cannot countenance the notion of an eye for an eye when genocide's at issue, nor apparently could we countenance a notion that hatred's bounty can be somehow disgorged. I simply want to stress one thing, and I'm going to be, well, first I want to quote somebody else. If you think of historical inquiries into the nature of evil and how to behave in the shadow of evil, that's not a normal set of inquiries. A Princeton philosopher, and we brought in victims, government officials, philosophers, anthropologists, et cetera, to give testimony. And a Princeton philosopher said to my committee, and I quote, "The map with the help of which we try to orient ourselves as human beings trying to live good and decent lives is a map with Auschwitz on it." And so what he meant was you cannot escape something that is virtually impossible to comprehend. And then I want to quote myself, because of all the, I've written a lot of things in public life, but of all the paragraphs that I've ever struggled in writing, this is the hardest. And I expressed this, I'd been invited to Israel by a prime minister named Barak because of these hearings, and at a event in Tel Aviv some 14, 15 years ago, here's what I said. And I'm going to try to read this as carefully as I can. Mass murder makes concern for mass theft insignificant except for the motivational linkage. Because it is clear that avarice was one of the motivating factors of the hatred in man that precipitated the Holocaust, it is imperative that we continue to focus the lens of moral accountability beyond the SS troops, mass graves, gas chambers, and furnaces that previously dominated historical scrutiny into the gray, shadowy corners of the Holocaust where greed reigned. The factories, warehouses, boardrooms, bank lobbies, salons, museums, and professional offices of Axis nations, neutral countries, occupied land, and even the Allied powers that eventually prevailed over the Wehrmacht. And what have we learned? In the stories of the victims and their persecutors, we have unearthed an axiom about the nature of evil. The genesis of evil may begin with perpetrators of violence and injustice, but complicity too frequently lies beyond the perpetrator in those who cloak themselves in the legitimacy of private business and genteel society while manipulating manifestly oppressive circumstances in furtherance of self-interest, oblivious to hate-driven crimes, even genocide. This lesson remains profoundly relevant for the ages. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer questions if I could. Yes.
I haven't done any research, but having seen the movie, it left it ambiguous at the end as to what the Russians would do with the art that they were to encounter from caves and other sources. And I was discussing this with a friend, and she said she had been at the Hermitage Museum in Russia, which I have not, and said that a lot is there. Do you have any information on that?
Well, what the Russians have argued, and there is a intrigued, I mean, it's an argument that has some credibility, but like in all things, you can make an argument. There's a difference between an argument and a compelling argument. But the Russians argued at the end of World War II that a booty of war, a legitimate booty of war, they argued, is the capacity to take everything of value, including art. And their argument was, we lost 20 million lives we're going to take all. We argued something very differently, and that became this phenomenal contrast. And so the movie showed in symbolic terms, because it wasn't precisely accurate, but that doesn't matter. This is a fictionalized true story. But there was a race. Now the race between Russia and America controlling property, and by that was principally land, and then where art happened to be stashed. This race symbolizes the Cold War to come. And that's why, say, George Stout / George Clooney may have been the first great step towards winning the Cold War. Now, the Russians have stated in the last decade or so that they're willing to consider giving back art that's proven to be of Jewish family origin. They haven't done it, but they have said that. What the Russians did after the war was, knowing that there is some difference in judgment on these legal issues, they refused for many decades to document what they had. And there's reason for that. Russia, under communism, was a bit of a kleptocracy. Now we have what might be considered corruptionism as a society succeeding communism. And corruptionism can be harder to root out than communism, possibly. We don't know yet, but it's possible. But if you don't document, it's easy for someone to steal. And so Russians would know that there was some value. And so if you were a museum director, you may or may not be perfectly attuned to the public interest. If someone sitting next to you is the head of the Communist Party of the town, they may be interested in a piece of art, and both of you would know it has some value, not only aesthetically, but you can put it on international art markets. So some of it gone on to international art markets. I suspect that the majority of Russian art that they glommed onto were probably in public museums, and then a part would have been taken from private hands. And so you have a combination of circumstance. But they have, and then the Russians, intriguingly, had one thing in common with Hitler, and that their modern art is an expression of freedom, as well as an expression of creativity. And Hitler, who was at one time wanted to be an artist and had a famous turn down of a Viennese art school. It's one of the few times in history we wished a school had accepted a less capable person. Maybe we'd have different history. But the Russians didn't give particular appreciation to modern art, even though in the period of the Russian Revolution and its immediate aftermath, Russia had some great artists, Malevich, Elizitsky, David Burliak, et cetera, that were really, truly innovative, great artists. But, and then they had some sculptors who were very innovative, like Tatlin. But the Western art, they didn't appreciate. And the other thing Russia had in common, less well, not in a genocidal sense, but sometimes in a murderous sense, the Russians as a people are pretty anti-Semitic, and that's why the word pogrom is identified so much with Russia, and frankly why so many Jewish people lived in Poland, because Poland was freer than Russia, although oppressive, but less oppressive than the Russians. And there was kind of a trade-off. The government would protect Polish Jews in exchange for compensation. And so, but anyway, Russians are more than slightly anti-Semitic. Stalin was a terrific anti-Semite. And like in Germany, modern art was considered disproportionately Jewish. In fact, I don't know if any of you have read the great biography of Einstein. I forget the chap's name that recently wrote it, or wrote it 7 or 8 years ago. But Walter Kaufmann. And Kaufmann wrote about Einstein and his detractors, and Einstein's kind of competitive relationship with many German scientists. And many of the German scientists referred to Einstein as part of, quote, Jewish science, Jewish physics. What is, I mean, how can there be such a thing? I mean, there is no such thing. And that was somewhat of an attitude of Russians too. But these are great moments to think through. Yes, sir.
I was,
Mr. Leach, I read that
I'll come to you next. Well, I'll come to you and then you
I
next.
read that Goring fell with 4 trains, one
oh,
for,
I'm sorry.
one just to hold the stolen artwork that he found. Now, 2-part question. First, is that true? And then, have you ever heard that? And second, did Goring actually have any real appreciation of fine art?
Well, oddly, let me repeat it. Did Goring have a whole train of art? Did he have appreciation for fine art, et cetera? What we do know is that Hitler had a personal appreciation for older art and for things that looked like they celebrated the male. And then oddly, as an artist, and we have extant works of his, and that many of you may or may not, a few of you might have seen. About 15 years ago, there was an exhibit at the Hoover Library of the art of Hitler, Churchill, Eisenhower. And shockingly, Hitler's art was impressionist. And can you visualize Adolf Hitler painting with pastels? I mean, it's just too bizarre for words. Now, having said that, Goring, nobody knows about his art background, but he clearly had an appreciation that art had value. And whether it was aesthetic or just art, and what appears to be the case is that Hitler had first choice of everything, and obviously, and again, as the movie indicated, wanted to do this huge museum in his home area. And Goring kind of had second choice. But whether he appreciated it, I don't know. As far as the train story is concerned, it is quite possible, but I don't know. I mean, it could have been under Goring's direction. Whether it all would have belonged to Goring is, who knows? Yes, sir.
Is there any difference in your mind morally between the repatriation of the Nazi removed art and the more recent push to repatriate art stolen by archaeologists from Italy and Greece?
Well, there are certainly analogies. I mean, I don't think anything matches the Nazi thing because it was so ghoulish. But it does relate to respect for peoples and their culture. And so stolen art, and that is the question, is stolen art today that a country might want, is there a case that can be made? And there's also an international law that applies to this. And when in 1988, back to Holocaust things, but there's some analogy here, when the Washington Conference on Holocaust Art was held, and I was chairman of the plenary session on this, we came up with 11 principles, virtually all of which related to the duty of museums and countries to look carefully at provenance. And what provenance means is who owned when. And that's the same issue that applies to this issue of a museum being approached by a country saying, we want things back. And this has been with us for a far longer period of time. If you know the famous Elgin marbles, do they belong to Great Britain? Do they belong to Greece? And so you have these things that come into play. I wanted to go to this gentleman, yes, and then I'll come up high.
I was part of a small group of German soldiers called USFA, U.S. forces in Austria. As the war ended, immediately, I was consigned to that group, and our job was to negotiate with the Russians and then be part of the Potsdam.
Excuse me, could you repeat this, because it's very profound. This gentleman is saying he was part of a group at the war's end coming into Germany and Austria. Yeah.
And we negotiated with the Russians to let us into Vienna, Austria.
You work with the Russians?
Yes.
Yes.
Russians. They had occupied before we got there. And in order for us for them to let us in, we paid them off boxes of occupation money, which is in order they could pay their troops who hadn't gotten paid for several years. Finally, I was one of about 200 GIs who went into Vienna. And when I got into Vienna, we were the first Americans. We drove into the city as people saw us because we wore fatigue uniforms. We didn't have any flags, American flags or anything else. As people were walking on the streets, they would try to get into some gates or homes, hide from us. They didn't know who we were. Finally, we did take place, and we took over some of the apartments and some of the hotels, and we were part of a 4-country occupation, which happened in Berlin and also in Austria and Vienna. And I spent about 4 months, 5 months in that city, and I lived in that city before the war started, from 1943 until 1939. So it was a homecoming, and I went back to my old neighborhood. And I'm sitting in my Jeep with my companion, my commissioned officer, and with me. And it looked like the city had, or the street had been bombed. Several artillery shells had hit some of the buildings. And apparently people didn't live there anymore. But the buildings that we had lived before the war, as I looked in there, I said, well, I don't think people live there anymore. But a woman came out of the building at that particular time because there's no water in those buildings. They never had restored it at that time. And if you ever been in Vienna, a lot of cobblestones on the streets. And she carried a pail. She kept her head down. And my companion and I sat in that Jeep. We took our hats off, our helmets, whatever we had on. And she recognized me and screamed my name. And all of a sudden, several hundred people came out of all buildings on the streets. And I got to welcome. But I thought I was the conquering hero.
Well, you were.
People who had kicked me out a few, 4 or 5 years or 6 years beforehand, all welcomed me and how wonderful it was. I gave away all my rations, whatever I had, because people had really very little to eat at that time.
Have you done an oral history?
Beg your pardon?
Have you done an oral history?
Yes.
Good.
They promised, they wanted me to come back, and I promised that I would come back, but I really found it very difficult emotionally to do that.
Well, thank you for being a conquering hero.
But I've been in Vienna a few times since that time, particularly in some of the provinces. I rode my bikes through Vienna, and one of the most moving places was Mauthausen, which is a concentration camp where a lot of people were killed. So if you ever go to Austria, it's the one of the only places that they kept the way it was. Okay?
Thank you. Well, thank you for that. Yes, sir.
There are abilities to make that claim. Still in there. Getting locked out as they those historical factors in understanding also what's going on.
Well, I think what you say is extremely profound. Let me mention one aspect of that. The United States and Great Britain are under what's called the common law. Most of the continent's under Napoleonic codes. And Napoleonic codes are a very credible legal system, but they have different rulings in the base on theft issues. And so, for example, if I see that this lady is wearing my watch that was stolen from me, I, in the United States, can demand it back, and a court would rule on my side. And then the only recourse you have is to go to the person who stole that watch, who you might have bought it from, to try to demand your money back. In Napoleonic Code countries, if I see you're wearing my watch and you'd bought it from the lady next to you, you may keep the watch, and the only recourse I have is for me to ask for compensation from the person who sold it to you. Now, the way that matters in, say, the art world is that if you have a piece of stolen art in the United States of America and a family member can prove it was their family's piece of art, they can go to court and demand it back. On the continent, as a general proposition, as is the case of the German that's been in the news so much in the last 4 or 5 months, who has these great stashes of art, if his father had bought that art from an intermediary, under German law, he would have the right to keep the art. And there is no recourse to anyone else. Now, there are other aspects of German law that relate to statutes of limitations, et cetera, that are somewhat different. But nobody in the continent has to return stolen art in many circumstances. Now, one of the things that the Washington Conference on Holocaust art tried to establish was that provenance had to be researched by museums, et cetera, and that museums should take at their discretion, accountability to give this artist back to the family. And many are finding the power of moral suasion more powerful than their legal system. And so some are cooperating with this. And some museums in Europe have made certain steps. But a European private citizen doesn't have to go along. So this is a great trauma. And it's hard in any Western society to do laws ex post facto. Now, in many regards, one can say this is a long time ago. On the other hand, from a moral perspective, there's no statute of limitations on genocide. Let me say, a lot of people are leaving. If you want to ask one more question, I'd be happy to address it. Yes, ma'am. Yes, it is. The question is it true that Franklin Delano Roosevelt turned back a ship of Jewish refugees? I don't know how precise the decision-making can land on Roosevelt, but it was his administration. And the ship involved is called the SS St. Louis, and it sought to land in the United States, and we turned it back, and it was filled with Jewish refugees. It was returned to Europe. A very few were allowed to depart in England if they had a relative in England who came and made a case for them. In fact, there is a wonderful professor at Rutgers who was a child on that ship and was able with her family to depart in England. But most were returned to the continent, and most were considered swept up in the Holocaust. And so this represents one of the great moral failings of the United States. Although Roosevelt almost certainly did it under law, that is, we had in the 30s a streak of nationalism that reflected not only neutrality statutes, but on immigration policy, on protectionist tariffs, et cetera. But he probably had the authority to waive the law, but did not. It wasn't a high point in the Roosevelt administration. Okay, yes.
This is Cal, and I got that question. Is there any validity that Eleanor Roosevelt tried to get him to let those people disembark from that?
Is there validity to Eleanor appealing on their behalf? I do not know that. We do know that Eleanor played an interesting mix-max role with the president. That is, the president on some human rights issues was not a progressive, and part of it related to politics at the time. The Democratic Party had an alliance with the Southern Democratic Party, which was somewhat racist, and so Roosevelt was not a great civil libertarian on civil rights issues. And as you know, it was a presidential declaration that put Japanese Americans into camp-like facilities, nothing like the Nazis did, but everyone could be fed, et cetera, and clothed, but they had lost their freedom. And that was not an act of Congress, it was an executive decree. Now, Eleanor played a very prominent role in reaching out to people in hardship positions, particularly in the civil rights arena. And so it's a credible possibility, but I do not know it. I would give you a family anecdote, which I think is kind of cute, having nothing exactly to do with it. Eleanor Roosevelt was my mother's graduation speaker in college at Drake University, and my brother's at Amherst College. So we feel kind of a family tie to Eleanor. Yes, sir.
There's a marvelous book written by Doris Goodwin about the relationship of Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt during the Second World War that I just finished reading. It touches on many of these aspects, and it almost seems as if she was Franklin's moral and social compass.
Well, I can totally accept that. Franklin, you know, had spent several years in a camp for people with physical disabilities in Georgia. And he was more Southern than people might suspect in attitude. And Eleanor was definitively not. And what I kind of hinted at in my talk, the one true common tie of mutual respect was Eleanor and Harry Hopkins, FDR and Harry Hopkins. They both adored Harry and trusted him. Let me thank you all, and I appreciate it.